It was April 17th, 1996, and Martin Decker was 51 years old when he walked into Riverside, New Holland in Waterloo, Iowa, intending to trade in a haybine that had served him well for 9 years. He had showered that morning. He wore his good boots. He had the title in his jacket pocket and a rough idea of what the trade-in value might be. He did not go there planning to change his life. He did not go there planning to co-sign a loan for two people whose names he didn't know. But that's what happened. And for the next 12 years, he paid for it in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars alone. Martin had farmed the same 280 acres outside of Grundy Center since 1971, the year he married Ellen, and the year his father finally let him take over the home place. It was flat ground, good soil, reliable if you worked it right. Corn and soybeans in rotation. A small herd of beef cattle that Ellen managed while Martin handled the row crops. They had two children, Sarah, born in 1973, and Jacob, born in 1976. By 1996, Sarah was finishing college in Ames, and Jacob was working construction in Cedar Falls, neither of them interested in farming. Martin never pushed. He understood that the work wasn't for everyone, but it meant the future of the place was uncertain. And that uncertainty lived in the back of every decision he made. The New Holland haybine he was trading in that April morning was a 499, a mower conditioner he'd bought used in 1987. It had cut clean through Timothy and alfalfa for nearly a decade, but the sickle bar was worn past the point of sharpening, and the rollers were starting to slip. He could have kept nursing it along, but Martin didn't like running equipment into the ground. There was a difference, he believed, between thrift and stubbornness. So he'd called ahead, told the dealership he was coming, and made the 30-minute drive south on Highway 20 with the title and his checkbook. Riverside, New Holland sat on the east edge of Waterloo, a flat-roofed building with a glass front and a gravel lot out back where the larger equipment sat in rows. Martin had been doing business there since 1978. The owner, a man named Dale Hoffman, knew most of his customers by first name and kept decent coffee going in the waiting area. It was the kind of place that still felt local, even as farming was starting to change around it. Martin parked near the front entrance and walked inside. Dale was behind the counter, talking on the phone, and he gave Martin a nod. There were two other men in the waiting area, both older, both in coveralls, drinking coffee and talking about rain. Martin poured himself a cup and stood near the window, looking out at the lot. He wasn't in a hurry. He liked the slowness of these transactions, the careful negotiation, the knowledge that you didn't buy equipment lightly. That's when he heard the voices. They were coming from Dale's office, just off the main showroom. A young man and a young woman, maybe late 20s, and Dale's voice, quieter than usual, almost apologetic. Martin wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the office door was open and the showroom was small. He heard the word financing. He heard the word declined. He heard the woman's voice crack just slightly, the way a voice does when someone is trying very hard not to cry in public. Dale came out of the office first, his face tight, uncomfortable. Behind him came the couple. The man was thin, with dark hair and work boots that looked new. The woman was blonde, wearing a canvas jacket, her hands shoved deep in her pockets. They didn't look at anyone. They walked straight toward the door. Dale caught Martin's eye and shook his head slightly, the way you do when something unfortunate has just happened and there's nothing to be done about it. Martin didn't know why he followed them outside. Maybe it was the look on the woman's face. Maybe it was the way the man had his hand on her back, steering her gently, protectively, toward a truck that was older than both of them. Maybe it was something else entirely, something Martin couldn't have named if you'd asked him. He called out before he thought it through. "Excuse me." They stopped. The man turned first, wary. The woman turned slower. Martin walked closer. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I heard a little of what happened in there. You were trying to buy equipment?" The man nodded. "A baler. Small square baler. We've got 40 acres we're trying to work. First year." He said it like a confession. "Where's your place?" "About 15 miles northwest, just outside Dunkerton. We're renting. Trying to get started." The man paused. "We don't have a lot of history with banks yet. That's the problem." The woman spoke then, her voice quiet but steady. "We've got the deposit, we've got the first 3 payments saved. We just need someone to take a chance on us." Martin looked at them both. He thought about 1971, when he was 26 and newly married and trying to convince his own father to let him make decisions about the farm. He thought about the equipment he'd financed over the years, the faith other people had placed in him. He thought about the fact that his own children had chosen different lives, and that maybe there was something decent in seeing 2 young people actually trying to start. "What's the baler?" he asked. "New Holland 316, used, 1989 model. They're asking $4,800. Martin did the math in his head. A small square baler, older model, fair price. Not a huge risk for the dealership, but clearly too much risk for a bank looking at 2 people with no credit history and a rented 40 acres. "How much do you have for a down payment?" $1,500, the man said. "And you've got the next 3 payments saved?" "Yes, sir." Martin looked back at the dealership. Dale was watching through the window, his arms crossed. Martin could walk away right now. He could go back inside, negotiate his trade-in, drive home, and never think about this moment again. That would be the reasonable thing to do. That would be what Ellen would tell him to do if she were standing here. But Ellen wasn't standing here. "I'll co-sign the loan," Martin said. The woman's eyes went wide. The man stared at him like he'd misheard. "I'll go back in there with you and co-sign. You make the payments like you said you would, and in 3 years it's yours free and clear. You default, it's on me. But I don't think you're going to default." "We don't even know you," the woman said. "No," Martin agreed, "but I know what it's like to need a start." The man extended his hand. "I'm David Carver. This is my wife, Amy." Martin shook both their hands. "Martin Decker, let's go back inside." The paperwork took an hour. Dale pulled Martin aside twice, asking if he was sure, reminding him what co-signing meant, making certain Martin understood the liability. Martin understood. He signed anyway. David and Amy signed. The dealership arranged delivery for the following week. When it was done, Amy hugged Martin, and David shook his hand again, harder this time, and promised they'd make every payment on time. Martin believed them. He drove home that afternoon without trading in his haybine. He'd forgotten why he was there in the first place. When he pulled into the farmyard, Ellen was in the garden, planting early peas. He stood at the fence for a moment, watching her work, and he knew he wasn't going to tell her what he'd done. Not yet. Maybe after the first few payments came through and everything was fine. Maybe then. The first payment was due June 1st, 1996. Martin didn't hear anything from David or Amy, which he took as a good sign. No news meant they were handling it. He went about his own work, planting, spraying, the usual rhythm of late spring. Sarah called from Ames to say she'd been accepted into a graduate program. Jacob called to say he was thinking about moving to Des Moines for a job. Ellen talked about maybe selling off the cattle in a few years, simplifying things. Life continued. July came, then August, then September. The corn was good that year, the beans decent. Martin combined in October, hauled to the elevator, paid down his own operating loan. He still hadn't told Ellen about the co-signing. There didn't seem to be a reason to. Everything was fine. In November, Dale called. "Martin, I need to talk to you about the Carver account." Martin's chest tightened. "What about it?" "They missed October's payment. I tried calling. Numbers disconnected. Maybe they changed numbers." "Maybe. But I thought you should know." Martin drove out to Dunkerton the next day. He found the address David had written on the loan application, a gravel road that led to a small farmstead with a white house and a machine shed. He knocked on the door. No answer. He looked in the windows. The house was empty. Not just empty like nobody was home. Empty like nobody lived there anymore. No furniture, no curtains, nothing. He walked around back. The New Holland 316 baler was gone. He stood there in the cold November wind and understood what had happened. They were gone. They'd taken the baler, stopped paying, and disappeared. And Martin was responsible for the remaining balance. He drove back to Waterloo and sat down with Dale. The remaining balance was $3,100. Dale was apologetic. He said he'd tried to warn him. He said he could set up a payment plan if Martin needed it. Martin didn't need a payment plan. He wrote a check for the full amount that afternoon. It cleared. The account was settled. He didn't tell Ellen that night either, or the night after. He told himself he'd handle it quietly, that there was no reason to worry her, that he'd made a mistake and he'd pay for it, and that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. In December, a collections agency called The House. Ellen answered. They were looking for David Carver. They had Martin listed as a reference. Ellen asked why. The agent said there was an outstanding debt on farm equipment. Ellen said there must be a mistake. The agent read Martin's name, his signature, the date. Ellen hung up and waited for Martin to come in from the barn. "What did you do?" she asked. He told her. All of it. The couple at the dealership, the co-signing, the missed payments, the $3,100 he'd already paid. Ellen didn't yell. She never yelled. She just looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before, something between disappointment and disbelief. "We don't have that kind of money to give away, Martin." "I know. Sarah's in graduate school. Jacob's trying to start his own life. We're not young anymore." "I know." "Then why?" He didn't have an answer that made sense. He'd thought he was helping. He'd thought they were sincere. He'd thought wrong. Ellen walked out of the kitchen. She didn't bring it up again for weeks. But something had shifted between them, a kind of distance that hadn't been there before. The $3,100 turned out to be just the beginning. In January 1997, another call came, a different collections agency. A farm supply store in Dunkerton where David and Amy had opened an account using Martin's name as a credit reference. They'd bought seed, fencing supplies, diesel fuel. The account was 60 days past due. The balance was $1,800. Martin called the store. He explained he'd never authorized the account. The manager said Martin's name and signature were on the reference form. Martin asked to see it. They faxed a copy. The signature looked like his, but he knew he'd never signed it. David must have forged it after Martin co-signed the Baylor loan. The manager said that was a matter for the police. Martin said he'd pay the bill. He paid it. In March, another call, a veterinary clinic in Waterloo. David and Amy had brought in a horse for treatment, used Martin as a credit reference, never paid the bill. $400. Martin paid it. In May, a tractor rental company. David had rented a small utility tractor for spring field work, listed Martin as guarantor, returned the tractor late and damaged. $1,200 in repairs and late fees. Martin paid it. Each time, Ellen found out. Each time, the silence between them grew longer. She stopped asking why he kept paying. She stopped talking about the future. She stopped mentioning the farm at all unless she had to. By the end of 1997, Martin had paid out just over $7,000 in debts that David and Amy Carver had accumulated using his name. He'd filed a police report. The sheriff's department said they'd look into it, but David and Amy were gone. No forwarding address, no way to track them. The case went nowhere. Martin took a part-time job that fall, working evenings at a feed mill in Grundy Center. He told Ellen it was to keep busy. She knew better. The money from the feed mill went into a separate account, and he used it to cover the debts as they came in. He didn't want to touch the farm income any more than he already had. The calls slowed in 1998. By 1999, they stopped entirely. Martin thought maybe it was over. He kept working at the feed mill anyway. He was 54 years old, running a farm during the day and loading feed sacks at night. His back hurt, his knees hurt. He didn't complain. Sarah finished her graduate program and took a job in Minneapolis. She came home for holidays, but the visits were short. She didn't ask about the farm. Jacob got married in Des Moines and didn't invite many people. Ellen went to the wedding. Martin stayed home to bale hay. He told himself it was because the weather window was tight. Ellen didn't argue. In 2001, corn prices dropped. Martin had a decent yield, but the income barely covered costs. He took out a small operating loan to get through the winter. It was the first time he'd carried debt into the next year in over a decade. In 2002, the drought hit. The corn withered in July. The beans didn't even try. Martin combined what he could and sold it at a loss. He worked extra shifts at the feed mill. Ellen started working part-time at the library in town. They didn't talk about why. In 2003, Martin's father died. There was a small inheritance, enough to pay off the operating loan. Martin put it toward the farm. Ellen wanted to use some of it for a vacation, something they hadn't taken in years. Martin said maybe next year. There was no next year. By 2005, Martin was 60 years old and still working 2 jobs. The farm was holding, barely. The cattle were gone. Ellen had sold them off in 2003 without asking him. He'd come home one day and the pasture was empty. She said it was one less thing to manage. He didn't argue. Sarah called less frequently. Jacob called on birthdays. Neither of them asked about taking over the farm. Martin didn't bring it up. In 2006, Ellen started having chest pains. The doctor said it was stress. He prescribed medication and told her to slow down. She didn't slow down. She kept working at the library, kept managing the house, kept living in the same quiet distance from Martin that had been there since 1996. One night in 2007, Martin came home from the feed mill and found Ellen sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. Bank statements, tax returns, a timeline she'd written out in her careful handwriting, tracking every payment Martin had made to cover David and Amy's debts. $11,400, she said. That's what you've paid over the last 11 years. Martin sat down across from her. He didn't argue with the number. Do you know what we could have done with that money? She asked. He knew. He'd thought about it every single day. We could have helped Sarah with her student loans. We could have given Jacob a down payment on a house. We could have fixed the roof on the barn. We could have done anything except give it to 2 people who lied to you. I know, Martin said. Then why did you keep paying? Because it was my name on the line. It was their debt. But it was my signature. Ellen looked at him for a long time. Then she folded up the papers and put them in a drawer. I don't understand you, she said. I've been married to you for 36 years and I don't understand you. She went to bed. Martin sat at the table until after midnight. In 2008, the economy collapsed. Corn prices spiked briefly, then fell. Credit tightened. Martin's operating loan came up for renewal and the bank asked for additional collateral. He signed over a portion of the land. Ellen signed too, her face blank. He kept working at the feed mill. He was 63 years old. Men younger than him were retiring. He couldn't afford to. In the spring of 2009, Ellen had a heart attack. She survived, but the recovery was slow. She couldn't work at the library anymore. Martin cut his hours at the feed mill to take care of her. The farm income wasn't enough. He sold 40 acres to a neighbor, land that had been in his family since 1923. Ellen didn't say anything when he told her. She just nodded. By 2010, Martin was 65. Social Security helped, but not enough. He was still working part-time at the feed mill, still farming the remaining 240 acres, still trying to keep everything together. Sarah came home that summer for the first time in 3 years. She walked the property with Martin, looking at fields that needed tile, at equipment that needed replacing, at a house that needed paint. Why are you still doing this? She asked. It's what I know how to do. You could sell, you could retire, you could actually rest. Your mother likes it here. Does she? Martin didn't answer. Sarah left after 2 days. She hugged him at the door and told him to take care of himself. He said he would. They both knew he wouldn't. In 2012, Ellen had another heart attack. This one was massive. She died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Martin was following behind in his truck. He watched the ambulance lights disappear around a curve, and he knew, even before the hospital called, that she was gone. The funeral was small. Sarah and Jacob came, a few neighbors. Dale from the dealership, older now but still running Riverside, New Holland. People said Ellen had been a good woman. People said Martin had been lucky to have her. He stood by the grave and didn't correct them. After the funeral, Sarah and Jacob asked about the farm. Martin said he'd keep running it. They didn't push. They went back to their lives in Minneapolis and Des Moines. Martin went back to the farmyard alone. He quit the feed mill that fall. He was 67 and too tired to keep pretending. The farm income barely covered property taxes and utilities. He started selling off equipment, piece by piece. The New Holland haybine he'd planned to trade in back in 1996, the one he'd kept running all these years, went to auction in 2013. A young farmer bought it for $800. By 2014, Martin was farming only 120 acres, renting out the rest. He lived on Social Security and a small pension from his years at the feed mill. The house was too big. He stayed anyway. One afternoon in late summer, he was at the hardware store in Grundy Center when he saw a man standing near the fence posts, looking at prices. Something about the man's profile was familiar. Martin walked closer. It was David Carver. Older, heavier, graying at the temples, but unmistakably the same man who'd stood in the Riverside New Holland parking lot 18 years ago and shaken Martin's hand. Martin's first instinct was to turn around and leave. His second instinct was to confront him. He did neither. He just stood there, watching. David turned and saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then David's face changed. Recognition and something else. Shame, maybe, or fear. "Mr. Decker," David said quietly. Martin nodded. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. I didn't think you'd still be around here." David looked down. "We moved back 2 years ago. Amy's family is from Jesup. We're renting a place out there." "You still farming?" "No. I work at the ethanol plant. Amy's a teacher's aide." They stood in silence. Around them, people shopped for bolts and paint and wire. The world kept moving. "I owe you an apology," David said finally. "I owe you more than that, but I'll start there. What we did, what I did, it was wrong. I was young and desperate, and I made terrible decisions. I knew you'd end up paying for it. I knew, and I did it anyway." Martin didn't say anything. "I tried to find you a few years ago," David continued. "I wanted to pay you back. I asked around. People said you were still on the farm, but I didn't have the guts to show up. I didn't know what to say." "You could have said you were sorry," Martin said. "I'm saying it now. I'm sorry. I can't give you back the money. I don't have it, but I'm sorry." Martin looked at him. This man who had cost him $11,000. This man who had cost him his wife's trust, his children's respect, his own peace. This man who had taken a single moment of generosity and turned it into 12 years of consequences. "How much do you think you owe me?" Martin asked. David hesitated. "I don't know the exact number. A lot, more than I can ever pay." $11,400, Martin said. "That's what I paid covering your debts, plus interest if we're counting." David's face went pale. "I didn't know it was that much." "Now you do." They stood there. Martin felt something shifting inside him, something he couldn't name. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anger either. It was just exhaustion, the deep tiredness that comes from carrying something too long. "You got kids?" Martin asked. David nodded. 3, 2 boys and a girl. "They doing all right?" "Yeah, they're good kids." Martin believed him. He didn't know why, but he did. "Then raise them better than you were raised," Martin said. "Teach them that when someone helps you, you don't disappear. You don't lie, you don't steal, you face it. You pay it back, you make it right." "I will," David said. "Good." Martin walked away. He bought what he'd come for, a box of screws and a roll of electrical tape, and drove home. He didn't tell anyone about the encounter. There was nobody to tell. That winter, an envelope showed up in Martin's mailbox, no return address. Inside was $200 in cash and a note in handwriting Martin didn't recognize. "This is the first installment. It won't be the last. DC." Another envelope came in March, another in June, another in September. $200 each time. Never more, never less. No notes after the first one. By the end of 2015, Martin had received $1,600. He put it in a savings account and didn't touch it. In 2016, the envelopes kept coming. Martin was 71 now, still living alone, still farming a little, mostly just maintaining the place. Sarah visited at Thanksgiving. Jacob came for Christmas. They talked about selling. Martin said maybe. The envelopes kept coming. $200 every few months. Martin stopped counting. He stopped expecting them to stop. In 2018, Martin sold the farm. A corporate operation out of Marshalltown bought it for the land value. Sarah and Jacob split the proceeds. Martin kept enough to move into a small house in Grundy Center, a place with 1 bedroom and a garage and a porch that faced south. The envelopes followed him to the new address. He didn't know how David found him. He didn't ask. By the time Martin turned 75 in 2020, he'd received nearly $8,000 in $200 increments. He'd never spent any of it. He kept it in the savings account, watching it grow slowly, wondering what it was for. In the summer of 2021, Martin had a stroke. Sarah came and stayed for a week. Jacob came for a weekend. They moved him into assisted living in Cedar Falls, a clean place with nurses and activities and other people his age who'd also outlived their farms. The envelope stopped coming. Martin died in February 2023, 3 months before his 78th birthday. Sarah and Jacob handled the arrangements. The funeral was small, a few people from church, a few old neighbors. Dale from Riverside, New Holland, now fully retired, came and sat in the back. When they went through Martin's things, they found the savings account, $8,400. They found the notes from the first envelope. They found the timeline Ellen had made, tracking all the payments. They found a folder labeled Carver with copies of every bill Martin had paid. They didn't understand any of it. Sarah called the number on one of the old collection notices, hoping to find some explanation. The agency was out of business. She called the sheriff's department. They had no record of any investigation. She called Riverside, New Holland. Dale remembered the incident vaguely, but couldn't help beyond that. Jacob wanted to keep the money. Sarah wanted to donate it. They argued about it for months. Eventually, they split it evenly and put it toward their own children's college funds. Neither of them ever learned that David Carver had kept sending money for 6 years. Neither of them ever learned that their father had kept every dollar untouched in an account that earned almost no interest. Neither of them ever understood why. The New Holland 316 baler that started everything disappeared into the used equipment market sometime in 1997. It changed hands several times over the years. In 2019, a hobby farmer in Minnesota bought it for $1,200 and used it to bale hay for horses. It still runs. The paint is faded and the knotter occasionally jams, but it still runs. Nobody who uses it now knows its history. Nobody knows what it cost. Nobody knows that a man named Martin Decker paid for it twice, once in money, once in everything else. The machine just keeps baling, season after season, indifferent to the question of whether saving a stranger is worth losing yourself.